The morning sun beat down on the dusty platform of Millbrook Station as Sarah Elizabeth Camden sat perfectly still on the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap like a proper lady should. The white cotton dress that had once been her finest now showed the wear of 3 weeks' travel from Boston to this godforsaken corner of Arizona territory. Her dark brown hair, once carefully arranged in fashionable curls, hung limp beneath a bonnet that had seen better days. Around her, the chaos of a frontier town unfolded. Men in worn leather chaps and faded shirts moved with purpose, loading wagons and herding cattle. Women in simple calico dresses hurried past with baskets and children in tow. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere except Sarah. She clutched the crumpled newspaper advertisement in her gloved hand. The ink had smudged from her nervous sweating, but she could still make out the words that had changed her life: wanted, respectable woman for marriage to established rancher. Must be of good character and willing to work. Fare provided for serious inquiries only. When she had answered that advertisement 3 months ago, Sarah had been desperate. Her father's death had left her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. Her mother had died when Sarah was 12, leaving her to care for a gambling father who drank away what little money they had. Now, at 23, she found herself alone in a world that had little use for unmarried women with no family or fortune. The train had deposited her here with a handful of other mail-order brides, each clutching similar advertisements and wearing their best dresses like armor against an uncertain future. One by one, they had been claimed by their intended husbands. Mary Sullivan, barely 18 with golden hair and blue eyes, had been swept away by a young merchant who couldn't stop grinning. Agnes Porter, a widow with practical hands and a no-nonsense manner, had been welcomed by a farmer who needed help with his 3 young children. But no one had come for Sarah. She had waited on this bench for 3 hours while the station master, a kindly man named Mr. Henderson, made inquiries around town. He had returned with apologetic eyes and the crushing news that her intended husband, a rancher named Thomas Brennan, had changed his mind. Word had gotten out that Sarah was not the fresh-faced beauty he had expected, and Brennan had decided to look elsewhere for a wife. These things happen sometimes, Mr. Henderson had said gently. Perhaps you might find work in town until you can arrange passage back east? But Sarah had no money for passage anywhere. The little she had possessed was gone, spent on the journey here. She was stranded in a place where she knew no one and had nowhere to go. The station master had posted a notice on the board outside his office: lady seeks employment or marriage proposal. Half fare to appropriate situation. It was the most humiliating moment of Sarah's life, being advertised like a piece of merchandise that no one wanted at full price. Men had come by throughout the morning to look her over like she was livestock at auction. Some made crude comments about her thin frame and pale complexion. Others walked away without a word after examining her worn dress and tired face. One particularly unpleasant character with tobacco-stained teeth had suggested an arrangement that would have required Sarah to work in the saloon in a capacity that had nothing to do with serving drinks. Each rejection cut deeper than the last. Sarah had never considered herself a great beauty, but she had received compliments back in Boston on her intelligent brown eyes and graceful manner. Here, she felt invisible except to those who saw her as damaged goods. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and Sarah's hope faded with each passing hour. She watched a freight wagon roll down Main Street, kicking up clouds of dust that settled on everything like a fine layer of despair. Children chased a hoop with a stick while their mothers hung laundry on lines stretched between buildings that looked like they might blow over in the next strong wind. This was not the life she had imagined when she had answered that advertisement. She had pictured a neat farmhouse with flower beds and, perhaps, a vegetable garden. She had dreamed of a kind husband who might learn to love her and children who would call her mother. Instead, she sat on a bench marked down like yesterday's bread, hoping someone would find her worth even half the trouble. A shadow fell across her bench, and Sarah looked up to see a tall man in a brown hat studying the notice board. He wore clean but simple clothes, a blue cotton shirt, dark pants held up by suspenders, and boots that had seen honest work but were well maintained. His hair was the color of wheat in summer, and when he turned slightly, she caught sight of a strong jaw and serious blue eyes. The man read the notice carefully, then glanced in her direction. Sarah quickly looked away, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She had been disappointed so many times today that she hardly dared to wonder if this might be different. He approached slowly, removing his hat as he drew near. "Excuse me, miss. Are you the lady mentioned in the notice?" His voice was deep and gentle, with no trace of mockery or crude interest. Sarah raised her eyes to meet his, noting the way he held his hat respectfully in his hands. "I am," she said quietly, proud that her voice didn't shake despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. "My name is Jake Morrison," he said. "I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here. I've been needing help with the household duties, and I wondered if you might be interested in discussing the position." Sarah blinked in surprise. He hadn't mentioned marriage, which was what most men assumed when they saw the notice. "What sort of household duties?" she asked carefully. "Cooking, cleaning, tending the vegetable garden," Jake explained. "I lost my housekeeper last month when she married the blacksmith. It's honest work with fair wages and a room of your own in the main house. Nothing improper, I give you my word." The relief that flooded through Sarah was almost overwhelming. Work was not what she had traveled here seeking, but it was respectable and would give her time to figure out her next steps. "That sounds very reasonable, Mr. Morrison." Jake nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "If you'd like to see the ranch and meet my foreman before deciding, I'd be happy to drive you out there. You could spend the night and let me know your answer in the morning." Sarah had learned to be cautious about trusting strange men, but something in Jake Morrison's manner put her at ease. He spoke to her like she was a person worthy of respect rather than a desperate woman with no choices. "I would appreciate that opportunity," she said, rising from the bench with as much dignity as she could gather. Jake helped her collect her single carpetbag and led her to a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 bay horses. He handed her up to the seat with the same courtesy he might have shown a lady stepping into a fancy carriage in Boston. As they drove out of town, Sarah allowed herself to feel the first spark of hope she had experienced since arriving in Arizona territory. The countryside was unlike anything she had ever seen. Red rock formations jutted up from the desert floor like ancient monuments, and mountains purple with distance ringed the horizon. Sagebrush and scattered cacti dotted the landscape, and, overhead, birds she couldn't name circled in the endless blue sky. "It's different from what you're used to, I expect," Jake said, noticing her wide-eyed examination of the scenery. "Very different," Sarah admitted. "But there's something beautiful about it. So much space and light." Jake smiled for the first time since she had met him. "Most people from back east think it's ugly and empty. They don't see past the surface to what's really here." Sarah wondered if he was talking about more than just the landscape. She stole glances at his profile as he drove, noting the way his hands held the reins with easy competence and how his shoulders moved beneath his shirt. There was something solid and dependable about Jake Morrison that made her feel safer than she had in months. The ranch, when it came into view, was more substantial than Sarah had expected. A white-painted house with a wraparound porch sat in a grove of cottonwood trees, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings. Cattle grazed in pastures that stretched toward the mountains, and horses moved like flowing water in a corral near the barn. "It's lovely," Sarah said sincerely as Jake helped her down from the wagon. "My father built most of it," Jake explained. "He brought my mother here when it was nothing but open range and a dream. She planted those trees and insisted on the flower beds around the porch." Sarah noticed the carefully tended roses and hollyhocks that softened the lines of the house. "Is she still here?" "No," Jake said quietly. "We lost her 2 years ago to pneumonia. Pa followed her last winter. Heart just gave out," the doctor said, "but I think he died of loneliness." The pain in his voice touched something deep in Sarah's chest. She knew what it was like to lose the people who mattered most. "I'm sorry for your losses." Jake nodded his thanks and led her up the porch steps to a front door painted cheerful yellow. Inside, the house was clean but had the unmistakable feel of a place that missed a woman's touch. Good furniture sat dusty and unloved, and windows that should have let in afternoon light were grimy with neglect. "I'm not much of a housekeeper," Jake admitted with embarrassment. "I can manage the ranch work fine, but this..." He gestured helplessly at the cluttered rooms. Sarah could see the bones of a lovely home beneath the bachelor disorder. The kitchen was well equipped with a good stove and plenty of workspace. The parlor had beautiful hardwood floors and comfortable chairs positioned near a stone fireplace. What it needed was someone who cared enough to make it shine. "It has wonderful potential," Sarah said diplomatically. Jake showed her to a bedroom on the ground floor that had obviously belonged to his parents. It was larger than any room Sarah had ever called her own, with windows facing east toward the mountains and a private washstand in the corner. "This would be yours if you decide to stay," Jake said. "I sleep upstairs, and my foreman Carlos has his own place near the bunkhouse. You'd have complete privacy." Sarah set her carpet bag on the patchwork quilt that covered the bed. After weeks of uncertainty and the humiliation of sitting unsold on that bench, this felt like a haven. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Jake went to answer it and returned with a man who looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and kind brown eyes. He had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his life working outdoors, but his manner was gentle and respectful. "This is Carlos Mendoza," Jake said. "He's been with the ranch for 15 years and pretty much runs the place when I'm not around." Carlos removed his hat and nodded politely to Sarah. "Welcome to the ranch, señorita. I hope you will be happy here." His English carried a soft accent that reminded Sarah of warm sunshine. She smiled and thanked him, noticing how he and Jake interacted with the easy familiarity of old friends rather than boss and employee. "Carlos, would you mind showing Miss Camden around the property while I start supper?" Jake asked. She might like to see what she'd be getting herself into. Carlos agreed readily, and Sarah found herself walking through gardens that had obviously been lovingly tended but were now growing wild with neglect. Tomato plants heavy with fruit drooped on broken stakes, and herbs had spread beyond their original borders to create a fragrant maze of mint and basil. "Senora Morrison, she had the most beautiful garden," Carlos explained sadly. "She could make anything grow, even in this desert soil. But, without her care." Sarah knelt to examine the struggling plants. "It could be beautiful again. It just needs attention and love." Carlos studied her with eyes that seemed to see more than most people noticed. "You know about gardens, señorita?" "My mother taught me," Sarah said, carefully staking up a tomato plant that was about to topple over. "We had a small garden behind our house in Boston. Nothing like this, but I understand the basic principles." She worked as she talked, automatically deadheading flowers and pulling weeds. It felt good to have her hands in the dirt again, to be doing something useful instead of sitting like a piece of unwanted merchandise. When they returned to the house, the smell of cooking food greeted them. Jake had managed to prepare a simple but hearty meal of beans, cornbread, and meat that he served on clean plates at a kitchen table that could easily seat 6 people. "I'm not much of a cook either," he admitted as they ate. "Most of what I know came from necessity after Ma died." The food was plain but filling, and Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Jake and Carlos talked easily about ranch business, which cattle needed moving, repairs needed on the barn, plans for expanding the herd. They included Sarah in the conversation, asking her opinions on small matters and listening respectfully to her answers. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah helped Jake clear the dishes while Carlos headed home to his own supper. The kitchen felt warm and welcoming with lamplight dancing on the walls and the comfortable sounds of domestic routine. "If you decide to take the position," Jake said as they worked side by side at the wash basin, "we can discuss wages in the morning. I believe in paying fair compensation for honest work." Sarah nodded, her heart lighter than it had been since leaving Boston. "Mr. Morrison, may I ask why you're willing to hire someone you've only just met? Surely there are local women who could fill this position." Jake dried a plate thoughtfully before answering. "I suppose because you remind me of my mother in some ways. Not in looks," he added quickly, "but in how you carry yourself. She had dignity too, even when things were difficult. And I saw you working in the garden with Carlos. You didn't hesitate to get your hands dirty or complain about the heat." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. After a day of being judged and found wanting, having someone see her as worthy felt like the most precious gift. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, and Jake showed her how to bank the fire in the stove for the night. He bid her good night at the bottom of the stairs, his manner respectful and proper. Alone in the bedroom that might become hers, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at stars brighter than any she had ever seen in the city. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she might have found a place where she could build a new life. Tomorrow she would give Jake Morrison her answer, but, in her heart, she already knew what it would be. After sitting Unsold at half price, she had found something better than marriage to a stranger who wanted her only for her appearance. She had found honest work and the possibility of respect. As she prepared for bed, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her luck had finally begun to change. Sarah woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows, warming her face as she stretched beneath the soft quilt. For a moment, she forgot where she was, then, memory flooded back, the train journey, the humiliation at the station, and Jake Morrison's unexpected kindness. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a practical brown cotton that wouldn't show dirt as easily as her traveling clothes. When she ventured into the kitchen, she found Jake already dressed and drinking coffee from a blue enamel cup. "Morning," he said, rising politely as she entered. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Sarah admitted honestly. The bed had been comfortable, but, more than that, she had felt safe for the first time since leaving Boston. Jake poured her coffee in a matching cup, and Sarah noticed how he handled the delicate china with careful hands despite their obvious strength. "I thought we might walk around the property this morning so you can see everything in daylight. Then, we can discuss the details if you're still interested in the position." Sarah sipped the strong coffee gratefully. "I am very interested, Mr. Morrison. But, I should tell you something about my situation so you can make an informed decision." Jake settled back in his chair, his blue eyes attentive. "I'm listening." Taking a deep breath, Sarah told him the truth about her circumstances, her father's debts, her lack of family or funds, and the humiliating experience of being rejected by her intended husband. She watched Jake's face carefully for signs of judgment or disgust, but his expression remained steady and kind. "That takes courage," he said when she finished. "Being honest about difficult circumstances. A lot of people would have invented a prettier story." "I discovered that lies have a way of catching up with you eventually," Sarah replied. "I'd rather you know the truth from the beginning." Jake nodded approvingly. "Then, let me be equally honest with you. This ranch is everything I have in the world. My parents worked their whole lives to build it, and now it's my responsibility to keep it going. I need someone I can trust to help me maintain not just the house, but the home they created here." The distinction between house and home was not lost on Sarah. She understood that he was offering her something far more meaningful than just employment. They spent the morning exploring the ranch together. Jake showed her the chicken coop where fat hens pecked contentedly in the dirt, the springhouse where milk and butter stayed cool even in the desert heat, and the vegetable garden that had once been his mother's pride and joy. "She could make roses bloom in the middle of winter," Jake said, touching a climbing rose that had grown wild on the garden fence. "Said it just took patience and believing in beautiful things." Sarah knelt to examine the root system of the neglected plants. "They're still strong underneath all this overgrowth. With proper pruning and care, this could be magnificent again." She could envision it clearly, neat rows of vegetables, herbs growing in orderly patches, flowers blooming in carefully planned succession to provide color throughout the growing season. Her fingers itched to begin the work of restoration. They walked to the barn where Jake kept his horses, and Sarah was impressed by the quality of the animals and the cleanliness of their stalls. Everything about the ranch showed careful management and genuine love for the land and livestock. "How many cattle do you run?" Sarah asked, shading her eyes to look out over the pastures where red and black cattle grazed peacefully. "About 300 head right now," Jake replied. "I'm hoping to expand gradually. The market for beef is growing, especially with the railroad making it easier to ship to eastern cities." Sarah heard the pride and ambition in his voice. This was a man with plans for the future, not someone content to drift through life without purpose. Carlos joined them for lunch, which Jake had prepared with the same careful attention he seemed to bring to everything else. The meal was simple but nourishing: cold meat, fresh bread, and vegetables from the neglected garden. "Señorita," Carlos said as they ate, "may I ask what you think of our ranch?" Sarah looked around the kitchen, noting the good bones of the room beneath the bachelor neglect. "I think it's a place with great potential. It needs a woman's touch, but the foundation is solid." Carlos exchanged a meaningful look with Jake. "That is what we hoped you would see. The ranch, she has been lonely since Senora Morrison died." After lunch, Jake and Sarah sat on the front porch while Carlos returned to his afternoon chores. The view from the porch was spectacular: rolling pastures dotted with cattle, the mountains rising purple in the distance, and an endless sky that made Sarah feel both small and significant at the same time. "I'd like to offer you $30 a month plus room and board," Jake said without preamble. "Sundays off unless there's an emergency, and I'll provide transportation to town whenever you need it." Sarah's breath caught. It was more than twice what she could expect to earn in Boston, even if she could find work there. "That's very generous, Mr. Morrison." "It's fair compensation for important work," Jake replied. "I won't pretend it'll be easy. Ranch life is demanding, and we're isolated out here. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and town is a hard hour's ride even in good weather." Sarah thought about the alternative: returning to Boston with no money and no prospects, or staying in Millbrook to scrape by on whatever work she could find. "I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation. In fact, after everything that's happened, some peace and quiet sounds wonderful." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Then, if you're willing, I'd be honored to have you stay." They shook hands formally, Jake's calloused palm warm and reassuring against hers. Sarah felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite identify: gratitude mixed with anticipation and, perhaps, something deeper that she wasn't ready to examine yet. "There is one thing," Jake added, looking slightly embarrassed. "I should probably warn you that some of the local women might not be entirely welcoming at first. A young unmarried woman living at a bachelor's ranch, well, people talk." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Let them talk. I know the truth of the arrangement, and so do you. That's what matters." Jake's admiration was clear in his eyes. "You've got backbone, Miss Camden. I respect that." That afternoon, Sarah began the work of making the Morrison ranch house into a home again. She started in the kitchen, scrubbing surfaces until they gleamed and organizing supplies with the efficiency of someone who understood the value of orderly systems. Jake watched her work with obvious amazement. "You don't waste motion, do you?" "My mother taught me that every movement in a kitchen should have purpose," Sarah explained as she reorganized the pantry. "Efficiency saves time and energy for more important things." As the day progressed, Sarah found herself falling into natural rhythms with Jake. He brought her fresh eggs from the henhouse without being asked, and she had coffee ready when he came in from checking the cattle. They moved around each other in the kitchen like dancers who had been practicing together for years. When Carlos came in for supper, he stopped in the doorway and stared. "Dios mío," he breathed. "It is like Senora Morrison has come home." The kitchen did look transformed. Clean surfaces reflected the lamplight, fresh flowers from the wild garden graced the table, and the smell of Sarah's cooking filled the air with warmth and welcome. Supper was a revelation. Sarah had managed to create a feast from the simple ingredients available: roasted chicken with herbs from the overgrown garden, vegetables prepared with butter and care, and biscuits so light they seemed to float on the plate. "Miss Camden," Jake said after his first bite, "if you cook like this every day, I'll gain 20 pounds before winter." Sarah blushed with pleasure at the compliment. "I enjoy cooking when I have good ingredients to work with. You keep a well-stocked pantry." As they ate, conversation flowed easily. Carlos shared stories about the ranch's history, Jake described his plans for expansion, and Sarah found herself contributing ideas about efficiency improvements and domestic arrangements that could support growth. "You think like a partner, not just an employee," Jake observed at one point. The comment sent warmth flooding through Sarah's chest. After years of being treated as a burden by her father and a disappointment by her intended husband, being valued for her mind as well as her domestic skills felt revolutionary. After supper, Sarah insisted on handling the dishes while Jake and Carlos discussed the next day's work. As she cleaned, she could hear their voices through the open window, calm, purposeful conversations about cattle rotation and fence repairs that spoke of deep mutual respect and shared commitment to the ranch's success. When the dishes were done, Sarah stepped out onto the porch to enjoy the cool evening air. The desert night was alive with sounds she was learning to recognize: the distant howl of coyotes, the soft lowing of cattle settling for sleep, and the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. Jake joined her, settling into the chair beside hers with a contented sigh. "Peaceful, isn't it?" "More peaceful than anything I've known in years," Sarah agreed. In Boston, there was always noise, carriages, people shouting, construction. Here, you can actually hear yourself think. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Sarah felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before, as if all the difficult roads in her life had been leading her to this porch, this moment, this unexpected chance at happiness. "Miss Camden," Jake said quietly, "may I ask what happened to your mother?" Sarah had shared the circumstances of her father's death but had been vague about her mother's passing. "Consumption," she said simply. "I was 12 when we lost her. She had been sick for almost a year. That must have been hard, caring for her so young." "She taught me everything she could in the time we had left," Sarah replied. "Cooking, sewing, managing a household, growing things. She said a woman needed to be capable of taking care of herself and others, no matter what life brought." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "She sounds like a wise woman. She'd be proud of how you've turned out." The simple statement hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear those words, that someone saw her as worthy, as someone a mother could be proud of. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected. Jake seemed to understand that she needed a moment to compose herself. He rose quietly and went inside, returning with a lamp that cast a warm circle of light around their chairs. "I usually read for a while before bed," he explained, settling back down with a well-worn book in his hands. "Hope you don't mind the light." Sarah glanced at the book's cover, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman. "I wouldn't have taken you for a poetry reader, Mr. Morrison." Jake chuckled. "My mother's influence. She said poetry was good for the soul, and she was right about most things." "Would you like me to read aloud?" "Some of these pieces are quite beautiful." The offer surprised and delighted Sarah. Her father had never been one for reading, and she had missed the sound of literature spoken aloud that she remembered from her childhood. "I would enjoy that very much." Jake's voice proved to be perfect for reading poetry, deep and measured, with a natural rhythm that brought the words to life. As he read passages about wide-open spaces and the dignity of honest work, Sarah felt the last of her tension from the difficult journey dissolve. When he finished the final poem, silence settled over them again, but it was the comfortable quiet of two people who had shared something meaningful. "Thank you," Sarah said as they prepared to go inside. "That was lovely. Tomorrow I'll show you the rest of the property," Jake promised. "There's a creek about a mile north that has the prettiest swimming hole you've ever seen, and a meadow where my mother used to pick wildflowers for the house." Sarah nodded, already looking forward to exploring more of what was becoming home. As she prepared for bed in her comfortable room, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday she had been a woman sitting unsold at half price, rejected and humiliated. Tonight she was Sarah Camden, housekeeper of the Morrison Ranch, valued for her skills and treated with respect by two good men who understood the meaning of honest work. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah allowed herself to dream about the garden she would restore, the meals she would cook, and the home she would help create in this beautiful, challenging land. For the first time in years, the future looked bright with possibility. 3 weeks into her new life at the Morrison Ranch, Sarah had settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. She woke each morning before dawn to start coffee and prepare breakfast for Jake and Carlos, then spent her days transforming the neglected house into the warm home it had once been. The transformation was remarkable. Windows that had been grimy with bachelor neglect now sparkled in the morning sun. Rooms that had felt cold and abandoned were filled with the sense of beeswax polish and fresh flowers from the garden Sarah was slowly bringing back to life. The kitchen had become the heart of the house once again, with herbs drying from the rafters and the constant aroma of bread baking or soup simmering. But it was the small touches that truly brought the house alive: lace curtains Sarah had sewn from fabric Jake brought from town, wildflowers arranged in mason jars on every table, and the sound of humming that followed Sarah through her daily tasks. The house felt lived in again, loved again. Jake watched these changes with something approaching wonder. More than once, Sarah had caught him standing in doorways just looking at rooms that had been transformed by her care and attention. He never said much about it, but she could see the gratitude in his eyes and the way his shoulders had relaxed as his home became truly habitable again. This particular morning found Sarah in the vegetable garden, working in the cool air before the desert sun became too intense. She had spent weeks clearing weeds and dead growth, and now the first new plantings were beginning to show promising green shoots. The tomatoes were responding especially well to her attention, and the herb garden was already providing fresh seasonings for her cooking. "You have the magic touch, Señorita," Carlos said, approaching with his hat in his hands and a smile on his weathered face. "The plants, they know you care for them." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and pushed a strand of hair back from her face. "They just needed someone to pay attention to them. Plants are like people in that way." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "See, that is very true. Like people, they flourish when they are loved." Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. The older man's eyes were kind but serious, as if he were trying to communicate something important without stating it directly. "Carlos, is everything all right?" Sarah asked. "You seem troubled." Carlos glanced toward the barn where Jake was working with the horses, then back at Sarah. "There is something I think you should know, Señorita. Some people in town, they are talking." Sarah's heart sank. She had been dreading this conversation since Jake had warned her about local gossip on her first day. "What kind of talking?" "Nothing too harmful yet," Carlos said quickly, seeing her worried expression. "But Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile, she has been asking questions about you. And the ladies at the church, they wonder why a young woman would choose to work at a bachelor ranch instead of seeking a husband." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from anger or embarrassment, she wasn't sure. "And what have you told them?" "The truth," Carlos said simply. "That you are a lady who works hard and treats everyone with respect. That you have brought happiness back to this house and that Jake, he is lucky to have found such good help." The way Carlos emphasized the word help made it clear he understood exactly what the gossips were implying. Sarah straightened her shoulders, drawing on the dignity her mother had taught her to maintain even in difficult circumstances. "I appreciate your discretion, Carlos. I knew there would be talk eventually." "There is more, Señorita," Carlos said gently. "The ladies in town, they are planning to pay you a visit this afternoon. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife. They say it is a social call to welcome you properly, but—" Sarah understood. It would be an inspection, not a welcome. The town's social leaders wanted to size her up and determine whether she was a respectable addition to their community or a woman of questionable morals who needed to be shunned. "Thank you for warning me," Sarah said sincerely. "I'll make sure to receive them properly." Carlos nodded and headed back to his work, but not before giving her an encouraging smile that reminded Sarah she had allies in this place, even if the broader community remained skeptical. Sarah spent the next few hours in a flurry of preparation. She bathed and changed into her best dress, the blue cotton one she had been saving for special occasions. She arranged her hair in her most conservative style and set out the good china in the parlor, which she had restored to gleaming perfection over the past weeks. She also prepared refreshments that would demonstrate both her domestic skills and her understanding of proper hospitality. Fresh bread with butter churned that morning, cookies made from a recipe her mother had taught her, and coffee served in the delicate cups that had belonged to Jake's mother. When the visitors arrived in a proper buggy driven by Mrs. Henderson's son, Sarah was ready to receive them with all the grace and dignity she could muster. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a stern-faced woman in her 50s, dressed in black silk with a bonnet that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. Mrs. Patterson was younger and prettier, with carefully arranged blonde curls and a dress that proclaimed her husband's success in business. Both women wore expressions of polite interest that didn't quite hide their underlying suspicion. "Miss Camden," Mrs. Henderson said as Sarah welcomed them into the parlor. "How kind of you to receive us. We wanted to call on you properly and welcome you to our community." "Thank you," Sarah replied, indicating the comfortable chairs she had arranged around the low table where refreshments waited. "I'm honored by your visit. Please, make yourselves comfortable." She served them with the perfect manners her mother had insisted upon, demonstrating the social graces that marked her as a lady despite her reduced circumstances. The women accepted the refreshments with approval. The food was clearly excellent, and the china was of good quality. "This is a lovely home," Mrs. Patterson observed, her eyes taking in every detail of the restored parlor. "You've certainly brought a woman's touch to the place." "Mr. Morrison has been very generous in allowing me to make small improvements," Sarah replied diplomatically. Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes missed nothing: the gleaming floors, the fresh flowers, the carefully mended lace curtains that added elegance to the windows. "You keep house very well, my dear. It's clear you were raised properly." The comment was both compliment and question. Sarah recognized the probing for information about her background and family. "My mother taught me well before her death. She believed a woman should be capable in all domestic arts." "And your family?" Mrs. Patterson asked with studied casualness. "They remained in Boston when you came west?" This was the heart of their investigation. Sarah chose her words carefully, sharing enough truth to satisfy their curiosity without revealing the full extent of her desperate circumstances. "I have no family remaining," Sarah said simply. "My mother died when I was young, and I lost my father recently. I came west seeking a new start." The women exchanged glances that Sarah pretended not to see. A woman with no family connections was both pitiable and potentially dangerous. She had no one to vouch for her character or constrain her behavior. "And Mr. Morrison?" Mrs. Henderson asked delicately. "How did you come to work for him?" Sarah had prepared for this question. "I met him when I arrived in Millbrook seeking employment. He needed household help, and I needed honest work. The arrangement has proven satisfactory for both of us." "It's certainly unusual," Mrs. Patterson said with a slight frown. "A young unmarried woman working for a bachelor rancher. In most places, people would consider such an arrangement improper." Sarah felt anger flicker in her chest but kept her voice level and calm. "I fail to see how honest work could be considered improper. Mr. Morrison treats me with complete respect, and I maintain my own quarters in the house. Carlos Mendoza can vouch for the propriety of all arrangements." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward slightly. "Oh, my dear, I'm sure your intentions are pure. But you must understand how it appears to others. A beautiful young woman, a handsome widower rancher, people will draw conclusions." "Jake Morrison isn't a widower," Sarah corrected gently. "He's never been married." The correction only seemed to make matters worse in the women's eyes. A bachelor was even more dangerous than a widower to a young woman's reputation. "All the more reason for concern," Mrs. Patterson said with what she probably thought was maternal kindness. "Men have appetites, dear. And isolation can lead to situations that might compromise your reputation, no matter how pure your intentions." Sarah set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, calling on every ounce of her mother's training in ladylike behavior. "Ladies, I appreciate your concern for my welfare. However, I am a grown woman capable of managing my own affairs. Mr. Morrison is a gentleman, and our arrangement is based purely on business considerations." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Henderson said soothingly. "But perhaps you might consider other options? Mrs. Patterson's aunt in Phoenix is seeking a companion, and the Methodist Church in Tucson has need of a teacher. Both would be more suitable situations for a young lady." Sarah understood that they were offering her a way out, a chance to preserve her reputation by leaving the ranch. Part of her was tempted. It would be easier to conform to social expectations than to endure the whispers and judgment she could already sense building. But, as she looked around the parlor she had restored with such care, thought of the garden coming back to life under her hands, and remembered the contentment she felt in this house that was becoming home, Sarah knew she couldn't leave. "I'm grateful for the suggestions," she said firmly. "But, I'm quite happy with my current position. Mr. Morrison is an honorable employer, and the work suits me well." The women exchanged another significant look. They had offered her respectable alternatives, and she had refused them. In their minds, that choice said everything about her character and intentions. Mrs. Henderson rose with the dignified air of someone who had done her Christian duty and been rebuffed. "Well, dear, the offer stands if you change your mind. Please feel free to call on us if you need anything." Mrs. Patterson followed her lead, adding with saccharine sweetness, "We do hope you'll join us for church services on Sunday. It's so important for young people to be part of the community." Sarah saw them to the door with perfect courtesy, thanking them for their visit and refreshments. But she could feel the chill that had entered their manner when she refused to be guided away from the ranch. After their buggy disappeared down the road toward town, Sarah sat on the front porch feeling deflated despite her successful defense of her position. She had won the battle but sensed that the war for social acceptance was far from over. Jake found her there when he came in for supper, sitting quietly and watching the sun sink toward the mountains. He took the chair beside her without speaking, sensing her mood. "Hard day?" he asked finally. Sarah told him about the visit and the women's concerns about propriety. She watched his face darken with anger as she described their thinly veiled suggestions that she should find employment elsewhere. "Busybodies," Jake said shortly. "They have nothing better to do than worry about other people's business." "They're not wrong about how it looks," Sarah said quietly. "A young unmarried woman working for a bachelor rancher. It does invite speculation." Jake turned in his chair to face her fully. "Sarah, do you want to leave? Because if you do, I'll help you find another situation. I won't have you staying here because you feel trapped." The use of her first name sent a little flutter through Sarah's chest. Somewhere over the past weeks, they had moved from the formal Miss Camden and Mr. Morrison to something warmer, though she hadn't consciously noticed the transition until now. "No," she said firmly. "I don't want to leave. This is the first place I've felt like I truly belong since my mother died. But I understand if my staying here becomes a problem for you." Jake's blue eyes were serious in the fading light. "The only problem would be losing you. This place has come alive again since you've been here. I'd forgotten what it felt like to come home instead of just returning to a house." Something in his voice made Sarah's heart skip. There was more than employer satisfaction in his tone, though she wasn't sure he realized it himself. "Then, we'll weather the gossip together," Sarah said with determination. "I've faced worse things than disapproving church ladies." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. "I believe you have. You're stronger than you know, Sarah Camden." As they went inside to supper, Sarah felt her resolve strengthen. She had found something worth fighting for in this desert ranch, not just employment, but purpose, belonging, and possibly something else that she was just beginning to recognize. The town might disapprove, but Sarah was learning that sometimes the most important thing was what you knew to be true in your own heart. And her heart told her that she was exactly where she belonged. 2 months after her arrival at the Morrison Ranch, Sarah stood in the kitchen kneading bread dough while a summer storm raged outside. Lightning illuminated the windows in brilliant flashes, followed by thunder that shook the house. Rain drummed against the roof in torrents that reminded her how precious water was in this desert country. She had grown to love these dramatic storms that swept across the territory with such power and beauty. They were nothing like the gentle rains of Boston. These were events that commanded attention and respect, much like the land itself. The kitchen had become her domain over the past weeks, a space that reflected her personality in every carefully organized detail. Herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams, preserves lined the pantry shelves in neat rows, and the constant smell of bread or cooking filled the air with warmth. It was a room that invited lingering, where Jake and Carlos often found excuses to remain after meals to enjoy the atmosphere Sarah had created. Tonight, however, Jake sat at the kitchen table longer than usual, turning a letter over in his hands with a troubled expression. He had received mail in town that afternoon, and, whatever the letter contained, had left him unusually quiet during supper. "Bad news?" Sarah asked gently as she shaped the bread dough into loaves. Jake looked up from the letter, his blue eyes dark with worry. "My cousin Robert in Denver. He's been managing some business affairs for me since my father died, and there's been a problem with the bank." Sarah's hands stilled on the dough. "What kind of problem?" "The loan my father took out to expand the herd last year. Apparently there was some confusion about the paperwork when Pa died. The bank is calling in the full amount, due within 60 days. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "How much?" $3,000, Jake said quietly, the amount heavy in the air between them. It was an enormous sum, more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and sat down across from Jake at the table, her mind already working through possibilities. "What assets do you have?" she asked practically. Jake appreciated her direct approach to the crisis. Another woman might have offered meaningless comfort or become hysterical at the news. Sarah's immediate shift to problem-solving mode reminded him why he had come to value her presence so deeply. "The cattle, the land, the house and buildings," Jake said, counting on his fingers. "But selling any of it quickly would mean accepting far less than it's worth. Cattle prices are down right now, and finding a buyer for the ranch in 60 days would be impossible." Sarah nodded, understanding the cruel mathematics of their situation. "What about partial payment? Could you negotiate with the bank for an extension?" Robert tried that. "The new bank president is a man named Harrison who apparently wants to make examples of delinquent borrowers. He's not interested in payment plans or extensions." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the storm rage outside. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. She had come to love this ranch as much as Jake did, and the thought of losing it to a heartless banker felt like a physical pain. "There might be another option," Sarah said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. "What if you had a partner? Someone who could help meet the bank's demands?" Jake looked puzzled. "Who would want a partner with a ranch that's about to be foreclosed on?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them. "What if you had a wife?" The words hung in the air between them like the lightning outside. Jake stared at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Sarah, what are you saying?" She pressed on, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Think about it practically. Marriage would give you access to my savings and anything I could earn or contribute. It would also silence the gossips in town who think our current arrangement is improper." Jake's face went through several emotions: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope before settling into concern. "Sarah, you can't be serious. You'd be tying yourself to a man who might lose everything he owns within 2 months." "I'd be tying myself to a man I—" Sarah stopped, realizing she had been about to say something that would reveal more than she intended. "To a man I respect and trust," she finished more carefully. But Jake had caught the hesitation, and his eyes searched her face intently. "What were you going to say?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the past months, her feelings for Jake had grown beyond respect and gratitude into something deeper and more complicated. She had tried to keep those feelings hidden, telling herself it was inappropriate to develop romantic attachments to her employer. But the crisis had stripped away her ability to pretend. "I was going to say a man I love," she whispered, the admission barely audible above the storm outside. Jake's sharp intake of breath told her he had heard. He reached across the table and took her hands in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Sarah, you can't marry me out of pity or some misguided sense of loyalty," he said quietly. "That wouldn't be fair to either of us." "It wouldn't be pity," Sarah said, meeting his eyes directly. "I love this ranch, Jake, but more than that, I love the man who built this life with such dedication and integrity. I love how you treat Carlos like family and how you've never once made me feel like a burden or charity case. I love how you read poetry on the porch and how you've let me bring this house back to life." Jake's thumbs moved gently across her knuckles as he processed her words. I never meant for you to feel obligated. I don't feel obligated, Sarah interrupted firmly. I feel blessed. When I was sitting on that bench in town marked down like damaged goods, I thought my life was over. You gave me purpose and dignity and a home. If I can return that favor by helping save the ranch, it would be my honor. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. And if I told you that I've been fighting feelings for you since the day you arrived? That watching you bring this house back to life has made me realize what I've been missing all these years? Sarah's heart leaped, but she forced herself to remain practical. Then, we'd be going into marriage as partners in every sense, not just as a business arrangement. But, you deserve better than a man who's about to lose everything, Jake protested. You deserve courtship and romance and a proper wedding, not a desperate solution to a financial crisis. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the dreams she had abandoned when her father died and left her with nothing. Jake Morrison, do you think I care about fancy courtship rituals? I've had months to observe your character, and that's worth more than 1,000 romantic gestures. As for a proper wedding, all I need is a good man and a preacher. Jake studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of doubt or reservation. What he saw was determination, love, and the quiet strength that had drawn him to her from their first meeting. Are you sure about this, Sarah? Really sure? Because once we take this step, I won't be able to let you go. I wouldn't want you to, Sarah replied simply. I told you once that I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation. I'm not afraid of taking chances either, especially when the chance is this good. Jake lifted their joined hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. Then, I guess we'd better get to town tomorrow and talk to the preacher. As if the storm had been waiting for their decision, the thunder began to fade and the drumming of rain on the roof gentled to a steady patter. Sarah and Jake sat together at the kitchen table, hands clasped and hearts full, planning their future and the fight to save the ranch they both loved. The next morning dawned clear and bright, washed clean by the storm. Sarah packed her few good clothes while Jake hitched the wagon for the trip to town. Carlos listened to their plans with a broad smile and many blessings in rapid Spanish. Señora Morrison, he said to Sarah with deep satisfaction. It has a beautiful sound, no? At the church, Reverend Mitchell listened to their request with surprise but agreed to perform the ceremony that very afternoon. As word spread through town, Sarah braced herself for the reaction of the social leaders who had tried to guide her away from the ranch. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson arrived at the church with expressions of shocked disapproval, clearly viewing the hasty marriage as confirmation of their worst suspicions about Sarah's character. Such a rush, Mrs. Patterson whispered loud enough for Sarah to hear. One wonders what the hurry could be. But Sarah no longer cared about their opinions. She stood beside Jake in her best blue dress with wildflowers from the ranch garden in her hair, speaking vows that meant more to her than any elaborate ceremony could have. Do you, Sarah Elizabeth Camden, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do, Sarah said clearly, her eyes locked on Jake's. Do you, Jacob William Morrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do, Jake replied, his voice strong and certain. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed Sarah gently, sealing their partnership in love and determination. The small gathering of well-wishers applauded, and even some of the disapproving church ladies managed polite smiles. That evening, as Mr. and Mrs. Morrison sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From sitting unwanted on a station bench to becoming mistress of a ranch she loved, it seemed impossible that so much could change so quickly. Any regrets? Jake asked, following her thoughts with the intuition that had developed between them. Only that it took a crisis to push us toward what we both wanted anyway, Sarah replied honestly. Jake squeezed her hand and smiled. Well, Mrs. Morrison, tomorrow we start figuring out how to save this ranch. Any ideas? Sarah looked out over the land that was now truly hers to fight for and felt determination fill her chest. Actually, yes. Several. Did you know that preserved vegetables and baked goods bring premium prices in the mining camps? And that the railroad is always looking for reliable suppliers of fresh eggs and dairy products? Jake's admiration was clear in his eyes. I married a brilliant woman. You married a desperate woman who happened to be good at planning, Sarah corrected with a laugh. But desperate people often find solutions that comfortable people miss. As they talked through possibilities and plans, Sarah felt the same sense of rightness that had guided her decision to stay at the ranch despite the gossip. She had been marked down and unwanted, but Jake Morrison had seen her true value. Now they would build something together that was stronger than either could have created alone. The woman who had sat unsold at half price had found something priceless: love, partnership, and a home worth fighting for. And tomorrow, they would begin the battle to keep it all.